Hello everyone, this is Will at Windblown. For those of you just tuning in, the link to the first video of this Let's Paint can be found by clicking the icon above. If you are tuning in for the first time, or if you've watched the previous videos in this Let's Paint, I just want to say that this video is a bit different from the others. For the rest of this video, I'm going to be painting this patio, and instead of talking about the intimate details of the task of painting a patio, I'm going to be talking about perspective. And wait! Before you switch away, I'd just like to say that perspective is more than just a means of spatial organization. It is a controversial and important topic that people aren't talking about, and I think people should be talking about it. Before I talk about perspective though, I just want to clarify, in my previous videos I had them going at 4 times speed. This video, just because I'm not really talking about what's going on in the painting, and I'm going to be doing the same thing throughout the entire painting, I'm ramping up the speed to 8 times speed. So unfortunately, you're not going to be able to go into the settings of YouTube to be able to see how fast I'm actually moving, but I don't think for this painting it's going to be that important, and if you are curious to see how fast I move for paintings, you can go down to the other videos. Now that that's out of the way, it's time to talk about perspective. When most people think about perspective, they think of a horizon with set points and a bunch of lines that converge on those points. I know of single-point perspective, 2-point perspective, and hell, I've even heard whispers of some mysterious 3-point perspective. Conceptually, these are all systems of interpreting and explaining relations of space with relation to a set viewpoint in an objective fashion. They are tools and they are objective. Once you've gotten the hang of it, it's not something you think about. I was first introduced to perspective in my 7th grade middle school art class. At the time, it was single-point perspective, and it totally blew my mind. Fast forward about 8 years to an artist residency when I eventually figured out that the reason the streetlight I had been engraving for the past 20 hours looked strange was because there's this thing called 2-point perspective, and I wasn't using it. But after that time, I thought I had perspective all figured out. It's just something fundamental that people don't think about. For anyone curious about what's happening right now, during the drawing phase of this painting, I drew a perspective grid where the patio is, and that's a pretty good example of how perspective is commonly used. It's just a tool which people don't think about. Coming back to my experiences with perspective, years later when I was studying metaphysical philosophy, I was introduced to René Descartes' meditations, and I was introduced to a system of doubt. Descartes was trying to build his own metaphysical system. A metaphysical system in its simplest terms is a system meant to explain the world through philosophy. But before Descartes could do this, he believed he needed to find a point of fundamental truth that he could build his entire metaphysical system off of. Whenever Descartes thought he found a point of fundamental truth, he came to realize that he really couldn't prove it was true. All these assumed truths were really just assumptions that he was conditioned to believe from his childhood. Long story short, Descartes concluded that because of the possible presence of an evil demon that might be tricking him into believing something wasn't true, he couldn't prove anything was true except for the fact he was thinking. Descartes presumed that the evil demon couldn't trick someone into believing they were thinking because being tricked into believing they were thinking about thinking is still thinking. For anyone wondering, this is where the famous Descartes quote, "I think, therefore I am," comes from. He didn't actually say it here, I don't think, if I remember correctly, but this is like the cogito where people point to for that type of thing. Tying this all back to perspective, after reading Descartes' meditation, I was thinking about things I didn't question, and I looked at things pretty differently. Not long after learning about Descartes' system of doubt, I humorously wrote a paper questioning if people actually used roads. Don't worry, because of the strategic placement of wolf charms besides roads in Anglo-Saxon England, I was able to conclude that people probably used roads. But being serious again and thinking about fundamental ideas I've been conditioned from a young age not to question, as an artist, a big one was perspective. What I soon discovered was that the system of perspective that I had come to not question, or in Descartes' words, had become one of my fundamental assumptions, was not as universal as I had thought. I've come to understand perspective was not an objective universal system. Instead, perspective as I knew it was a social construction modeled after Western values of art making. As I explored perspective and spatial organization in non-Western contexts, I came to realize that there are different systems of perspective reflecting different sets of values in the Western system. What I'm talking about is much easier shown than explained, but basically looking at traditional Chinese paintings, unlike Western paintings, space is not organized about 2 points with relation to a horizon as it appears for observation. I could try to process these paintings in Western terms and break down the different lines and compositions, but this isn't what I find exciting about these paintings. Chinese paintings are not driven through observation, they are driven by conceptual ideas. Space is achieved and compositions are formed by the combination of independent visual registers that are driven by the ideas of the artist. For anyone studying realism or has been interested in the history of realistic painting, one of the major things that really changed the game for painting from life has been the photograph. And it's kind of interesting seeing how Western artists have dealt with this sort of thing, in that they've had to totally rethink their position in the art world versus Eastern artists, where because their artwork was always driven by ideas and not from observation, they really never felt threatened from the advent of the photography because they saw it as occupying a different space and doing a different thing from their paintings. When I first came into art school, I thought to be an artist, it was the thing that was primarily important was your technique above anything else and your skill through which you could articulate reality. But as I've been studying art over the years and as I've spent a lot more time with art, I've come to realize that the thing that really matters is not your technique, but it's more your ideas and the way those ideas shape the way that you choose to use those techniques. That's not to say I'm willing to take a position as extreme as some of my professors, where I would go out to say that your technique doesn't matter at all. And I do think that there is a place for technique. It is kind of the language through which you articulate ideas. But when it comes down to it, the thing I found that separates one artist from another is really their ideas. When I'm talking about this sort of thing, I'm also thinking about the relationship between painting and photography. And it's kind of interesting. A lot of painters have a very hostile relationship with photography, like they see painting as some type of superior medium, and the photographer has no hand or no expression in the actual image creation. But I am someone who really likes photography a lot, and my experiences with photography is that the artist has a lot of control and a lot of hand in their act of creation. I really don't have a great answer to explain why I paint, except for the fact that I've always painted, and kind of like the way you write with your hand or the type of language you choose to express yourself with, I've just always expressed myself with painting. This sort of thing gets a little bit confusing when I'm talking about painting, but I'm not actually painting. For instance, when I am printmaking, I will, at least in my mind, be thinking about it as a painting, which for me it's more of a thought process. Bringing this back to the subject of Eastern perspective, the two artists I'm going to be talking about are Bada Shunrun and Shi Tao. I like to compare these two artists a lot because they have similar background, but their artwork is incredibly different, but at the same time, in a lot of ways, it's kind of the same. Bada Shunrun and Shi Tao were both former Ming princes at the time the Ming dynasty fell, and they had to do a lot to their artistic practice to escape persecution. Bada Shunrun would go about trying to convince people that he was schizophrenic and try to avoid attention, where Shi Tao, who was much younger at the time of the fall of the Ming dynasty, would take a much more confrontational approach with his heritage and openly admit the fact that he was part of the Ming. Bada Shunrun didn't play with perspective too much because he wasn't really making the type of Chinese painting that did play with perspective, but he did play a lot with spatial organization. He pretty infamously would put fish flying through the sky, and he would put angry-looking, brooding birds on the ground. And while a lot of art historians, when they first came across Bada Shunrun and after reading his really cryptic descriptions, assumed that he was crazy, a lot of art historians now are speculating that there was this kind of grand narrative throughout his work, where it was him expressing his desire to transform from a fish into a bird and be able to fly south, which at the time is where the Ming court was surviving. There is a very sad narrative throughout Bada Shunrun's work because it's not something he would ever do, and eventually he would just accept his place within the Qing society, and he would just kind of give up on his aspirations for the world. While a big part of that narrative was told through his descriptions, another really important part of the way he visually reflected it was through spatial organization. I'm going to be honest, Shi Tao is a lot more difficult to talk about, and it requires a much better understanding of Chinese culture and Chinese painting to really be able to do him justice. But from what I could gather from studying him for a while, is that he really was experimenting with a lot of different things, and he didn't like following conventions. of what artists were supposed to follow that were established by this artist named Dong Chichong in a much earlier time period. Dong Chichong's whole thing was that art should be made that is in dialogue with art that was created in the past, and this meant that compositions and spatial organization was one thing that was copied from painting to painting. Because Shitao was trying to break away from this type of thing and Shitao wasn't interested in continuing this precedent, Shitao isn't really looking to these artists for examples of composition, and he's really trying to come up with his own kinds of ways of organizing space that break the mold. As I understand Shitao, painting to Shitao was more of a performative act, and spatial organization and perspective tied into his concept of the one stroke, which was basically he believed that a painting should be laid out in a singular stroke, which has a lot of implications in Chinese calligraphy because stroke order is really important where one stroke is related to another stroke. Summarizing this all, in some forms like Bada Shanren, this served narrative implications of the painting, where for someone like Shitao, I think that this type of thing conveyed a combination of his emotion and philosophy. A lot of them reflected social values like literati education through the display of different combinations of calligraphic marks. The purpose of this video is not to make an apology for this sort of thing. It's been kind of one of the bigger revelations I've had as I've been studying things, that a lot of things I assumed were like perspective or philosophy were really just Western philosophy and Western perspective. And this is a pretty big problem in the world of education and the world. This is because calling things like Western philosophy and Western perspective just philosophy and perspective as subconsciously puts these ideas in a position of superiority of, say, Eastern philosophy and Eastern perspective. I'm probably not the best person to talk about this type of thing because I'm not really invested in academia, but I am aware that this is an issue and I'm trying to break away from my old habits that I was conditioned from a young age and the way I was taught to think about these sorts of things. The purpose of this video is to talk about perspective. Perspective was something I didn't think about much until I began to actively try to question things I assumed. I made this video with the hopes that you might question something fundamental that you'd never thought about, and maybe, just maybe, think about it differently or learn something new. Where I once believed I had everything figured out and all was left was draftsmanship and math and just execution, suddenly there was an entire world of possibilities from which I could draw up new compositions and rethink how to organize space. I realize this might sound lame, but for me it's really exciting. I don't really know how to articulate this, but it's a really great feeling to rediscover something that you haven't thought much about, and for you to discover a whole new canon of art to be inspired by. Yes, I'm not Asian, and yes, this is culturally appropriating, which will make some people mad, but I'm excited about it. And I'm gonna be inspired by things outside of the framework my culture obligates me to be inspired by. Identity politics is a really big thing in the art world, and I'm going to abstain from talking about it here for the fear of making an overgeneralized statement. My perspective on identity politics is from the position of someone who has a Western background, specifically a white male, and I'm fortunate enough to live in a time period that recognizes the importance of the diversity of background and voices and what they can contribute on issues like identity. That being said, the subject of cultural appropriation is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and something I've spent a lot of time with. Something I've learned with the subject of appropriation is there's a lot of shades of gray. When I think about this topic of appropriation, I think about one of my favorite artists, who's James Abbott McNeill Whistler. Whistler was an artist that was really heavily inspired by Japanese woodblock prints, and he was alive during the craze in France where people were really heavily fetishizing Japanese things. It was an art movement called Japanesism. And for me, at least, the thing I kind of think about with McNeill's work where cultural appropriation is a bit too far is when he has these white models that are posed like geisha girls and just kind of showing off all the Japanese material culture that Whistler has in his collection. So that's an example where I didn't really like the way he was appropriating Japanese culture. But then you have another piece like Whistler's Mother, where he's very subtly employing what he's learned from Japanese prints, where he has this really interesting shape with the shadow that hints at a influence of the Japanese concept of notan that I was talking about in the first video, which, to explain in basic terms, is the composition of an image in just a binary of black and white and try to make that black and white shape as expressive as possible. What I find interesting about this painting is most people aren't entirely sure what they find interesting about this painting. Like there's something that is there, but they can't quite put their finger on it. Some people think it's because of just the starkness of a woman against a wall in that kind of serious, grim looking face, but I happen to think it's about just the general abstract shape of the figure on the wall. Which, in my opinion, and a lot of art historians also share this opinion, that shape is something that they think, and I think, came from Whistler's study of his woodblock print. And nobody is exactly sure which woodblock prints he owned, but I'd like to think that he wasn't trying to explicitly copy them, but he was trying to learn from them and pick up little tricks, not knowing exactly what they were, but seeing what he could learn and get inspired by from looking at these new things. Okay, I think that's enough talking about cultural expectations and cultural appropriations, and I'm probably not done talking about this sort of thing because it's a really important thing, I think, to me and to a lot of artists. But within the context of this video, I kind of want to move on. The final part about this video, I'm going to really tie this back to this painting and how all these things I've talked about are going to be implemented in the ideas that are going into this painting. And for anyone listening to this, I just wanted to say it's a really helpful thing to talk about these things because through the process of writing this, I really discovered things that I was sort of thinking about, but I didn't have the words to articulate. So bringing this back to the painting, I'm not trying to subvert spatial organization to pretend I'm schizophrenic like Bada Shenren or really break away from the Western system of perspective. What I'm doing is thinking about the painting in terms of independent spatial registers, like a lot of these Chinese painters I admire. And the area I'm really thinking about this differently is the patio, where the rest of the painting is going to be very highly modeled, generally how my paintings usually are everywhere. I'm gonna leave the patio much more open, much more bare than the rest of everything. I'm gonna probably have a lot of the underpainting peeking through in the final version, which for me is not something I usually do, and it's something that I'm kind of uncomfortable doing. But I really want this patio to have that kind of unfinished feeling to it. This might not be a feeling that's shared from everyone else, but I just have a lot of experience painting over grisailles, and when I see a grisaille or a little piece of grisaille that's peeking through a painting in the finished layer, my impulse is to paint over it or to try to stop it out because it's a little imperfection which I want to cover up. And I guess as I'm becoming more mature as an artist, I'm learning that those little imperfections and those little things that I would normally cover up are quite beautiful when you take a step back and look at them. And that's kind of what this painting is about, is taking a step back and appreciating the beauty in this finished but unfinished scene. Thinking about this painting and thinking about this patio, I'm kind of thinking a lot about my life and my experiences in my life over the year. And something that's come up a lot, and I've never really had the words to explain, is there's this very specific state where something is finished but unfinished. It's the state where something is in progress, but it also won't progress any further, and therefore it's in a state of completion. That's what I'm trying to paint with this patio, and that's how I'm going to leave it, because this is really the reality that I'm trying to express, because this is reality. Maybe it is different for other people, but this is how things are for me, and that's how I want it to be for my painting. Oddly enough, I find these things kind of beautiful. Maybe it's just kind of a beauty that I can relate to, because it's something that I've experienced a lot, but this is just the type of thing I want to make a painting about. It's not a beauty that exists in my imagination, it's something I experience every day, and that's what I like about it. We're just about at the end of this video. What did you think of this video, and what did you think of my ideas? I talked about a lot of things in this video, and I can go into a lot of things in a lot more detail if you'd like. What do you think of this style of video with a script that I spent a lot of time writing and revising and recording, as opposed to something more spontaneous like the last video? Let me know in the comments. And if you like what you heard here, it would really mean a lot to me if you liked this video and subscribed. Next week, the video probably won't be as heavy as this, just because I'm still pretty new to this YouTube thing and I'm experimenting a lot, so I'm probably going to be trying out a new video format and approaching this a different way. And if you're still here, thank you for listening and thank you for watching. It really means a lot to be heard. Thank you again, and have a nice day.